And so as you can see from the chart, the most circulated Washington Post article was maybe tens of thousands of times. Boston Globe didn't even register. And for a lot of people, this became evidence. I feel like I can stand here and it picks up good. For a lot of people, this became evidence of false news being a really huge problem. That's something that only existed for a couple weeks up until this point could be circulated so dramatically, for a lot of people became a huge problem. But we have to remember, so this is one story on one day that had a ton of circulation, but that doesn't mean that every false or fake or whatever kind of news article shares that much, right? Thousands are created, they're kind of thrown out there. Some take off, some don't. And that's the same thing that happens to, even the Boston Globe. They post something on Facebook, some stuff takes off, some stuff doesn't. And so part of the problem with something like the Denver Guardian is that the Boston Globe and other news sources were like, hey, this is not a real story. And so they tried to debunk the story as they've started doing with other sources. But this isn't always helpful. How many of you have heard about Pizzagate conspiracy? A couple people, right? So the conspiracy was that there was a pizza shop in the DC area that was the home to a child trafficking ring run by Hillary Clinton and some associates. And so, we ended up, researchers traced this back to kind of a joke that originated on a social media platform. And it was circulated for some people as a joke, and then it kind of got picked up into conspiracy circles as like, there's something true to this. And then news outlets started being like, no, it's not real, trying to debunk it. But the problem was the stories about it were circulating much farther and much more quickly than the debunking was. And the same thing happens in this scenario. So oftentimes when various fact checkers or orgs try to engage with sources that they deem to be false or misleading, that those can actually have a counter effect and make them circulate even farther. And so if you remember with Pizzagate, when people were coming out to say like, no, this is not true, it actually made people dig in a little bit more. Like, no, because I do not believe you saying it's not true, and so we're going to figure this out for ourselves. And so why would people feel like they couldn't trust the debunking or the tales to the contrary? And it's mostly because there's a growing distrust in mainstream news organizations. And so Gallup and Pew, they've released several charts. And so the idea is, overall, over the last 20 years, people do trust journalists much less than they once did. And this can vary. I have a graph that shows political differences, but this can vary by age, by where you live. So people who are very far removed from a newspaper, who live in, like where my parents live, there's one paper left, and it's pretty far away from them. And so like that can also breed distrust because you don't know who's creating your news. But this chart shows that over time, regardless of your political affiliation, that distrust has gone down. And this is especially the case if you identify as a Republican. But it's also the case if you identify independently or as a Democrat. And so one question people ask, well, why is distrust lower amongst Republicans? And it's because of perceptions of bias. So if you perceive news organizations to be biased or to be incorrect, you might be more likely to believe alternative sources that are trying to appeal to you. And it also might be why you might turn towards other sources entirely. And so a professor put this kind of quick and dirty chart, and people can disagree with some of the categorizations, etc., on Facebook in order to try to capture the differences in the new media sphere, the kinds of stories that we all come across on a daily basis. And so you can see sort of in the center NPR or the New York Times, Reuters, which is a like newswire. On the left you might see MSNBC, Vox, who I already referenced, on the right, something like Fox News. And then from top to bottom, you see sort of complexity of the narratives and how news is reported, with something like The Hill or The Economist being more thorough and contextualized, more data-oriented, and then something like The Blaze or The Daily Caller being a little bit more simple in their storytelling and sometimes less accurate. Same thing on the left with US Uncut and Addicted Info and other sources. And so we have this burgeoning sort of media sphere. There are more sources that we can go to for our news than ever before. And one of the problems, or good things actually, is that most people are now getting their news from social media. And so we might be biased in this room. How many of you still get a newspaper delivered to your door or read a newspaper online every day? Me too. Okay. Do you watch television news as well? One. So, okay, 3 of us. Not if you can help it. Yeah, and I'll talk a little bit about cable news in general can be kind of a problem. But actually, the younger you are, the more likely you are to get all of your news from Facebook or Twitter. And so on there, all of these different sources all come into your feed and they all look the same. And so a story by the BBC might be, just one story in your feed away from something like Occupy Democrats. And it all looks like news. And because even people who are more liberally minded might not trust traditional news like we once did, then we might be more likely to click on those other sources. And I'll get into a little bit more why that's the case in a minute. But first I wanted to talk, I'm sorry, this is kind of small, about all of the different kinds of false news that can exist. And so Claire Wardle, who has a PhD in communication, and she runs or works at a place called First Draft News. She analyzed a bunch of news sources to try to figure out what makes something false and why is it false. And so on the far left, you see satire or parody. So for a long time in my field, if I was talking about false news or fake news, then I was talking about The Daily Show or The Onion or any other type of organization that is satirical. And so they're not trying to harm people, but they are putting out false information, usually for the purposes of humor or for political commentary. So that can be one kind of false news. Then there's also misleading content. So content that is generally true, but might be framed in particular ways with, everyone here has probably seen one too many headlines that just are shameful. Even when my news source went viral, I was joking with a reporter from the Boston Globe because I was like, please don't call this a fake news list because that's not what it is. And I said, and the reporter asked, well, what should it be called? And I was like, it should be called a student resource containing false, misleading, clickbaity, and satirical news sources. And he was like, that's not a headline. And so what they did as kind of a joke, they said, math teacher makes a list. You won't believe what happens next, right? So to try to play with the kinds of headlines that we see for better or worse. You also have stuff like imposter content. So websites that are designed to look like ones that we might come across purposefully. So if you want to go to ABC News, you might go to abcnews.com.co or .website. You also have completely fabricated content. And I'll talk about the example I was fooled by even as a media professor in a minute. And so that's just totally false, cherry-picked out of nowhere. And then there's also false connections that can be drawn between people and places and things. False context, which I'll also talk about, when you take a photo and then use it for something totally different than its original intent. And then further manipulation. So there's all these different ways in which content or news can be false. And again, this isn't always apparent to us when the way we're coming across it, it all looks kind of the same. And so this is one my students really appreciate. It's called Reductress, and the headline says, this woman had over 50 plastic surgeries to become human Cabbage Patch Kid. And so this is meant to be humorous, satirical, and it's unlikely anyone was sharing this as like, some woman was trying to become a Cabbage Patch Kid, right? But this is an example of the kind of false news that really isn't out to even comment politically. It's for the purposes of humor. Similarly, these are two that kind of inspired my involvement into this. So the one on the left, I shared on Facebook. During the Democratic primary, I supported Bernie Sanders, and also I'm from Wisconsin, and I'm from Green Bay, so I'm a Packers fan. Please don't hate me. And the story reported that Aaron Rodgers was endorsing Bernie Sanders. And so I was like, cool. I read the headline and I shared it. And therein lies the problem. Many people actually, according to several studies, share without actually reading what they're sharing. And headlines carry a lot of informational weight. So I shared that, and friends were quickly like, no, that's not happening. That's not a real news organization. And similarly, you might appreciate this, the one on the right, WTOE5 News, not an actual news organization, right? It's a website someone created. It's not even that old. But the headline says, Pope Francis shocks world, endorses Donald Trump for president, releases statement. And so this is strange, right? The Pope never endorses any US candidates. Like, that's not something that happens. And so this one was actually circulated a lot by people who identified more liberally because they were outraged that something like this could happen. And interestingly, the way that I came across this, so I mentioned my grandmother is a Facebook user, and she is also extremely Catholic and very political. And so we were talking about who we were going to be voting for in the election. She saw this article that my uncle sent her. She printed it off and mailed it to me. So I got false news in the mail, and I asked my grandmother why she didn't just share it with me on Facebook, and she trusted that the mail would make sure that I actually saw it. And for her, this was very persuasive because, as a Catholic, she's like, well, I mean, I know what I'm doing, right? It led to conversation. But here's an example of something that can be very consequential, but is also kind of silly, but another type of fake news. So this is just totally made up out of nowhere. The other example that really inspired why I got involved in this came from a student of mine. And so I teach an introduction to media course, and we spend a month talking about journalism and the news industry and problems in the news industry. And my students and I were debating bias. So not just political bias, which is what most people talk about, but other forms of bias. So corporate bias or entertainment bias, why we might see way more stories about like a goat parade. There actually is going to be one in New Hampshire in a couple weeks, but I've learned a lot about it thanks to the news. Why we might see more about goat parades than policy, because goat parades will be circulated much more quickly, they'll generate more advertising revenue. So there's entertainment bias, corporate bias, political bias. There's also medium bias. So why you might not like television news is because of medium bias, because of constraints in how you can tell stories on television is different from a newspaper or the internet. And so my students, like many people, still focused on that political bias. And so my student showed me this picture and was like, well, why is there a Newsweek cover saying Madame President? Like, the election has not happened yet. This came out like a week or so before the election. And so we decided to do some digging, and we did a reverse image search, and we found a tweet by Milo Yiannopoulos, who was formerly a tech editor for Breitbart. He's been in the news a lot lately. And Milo captions the tweet, Newsweek is already, it's so small on my screen. Newsweek has already sent this out to bookstores. Their hubris is just another example, another reason to vote Trump. So he was saying, clearly it's not just political bias, this is conspiratorial levels of media involvement. And so we traced this picture from Twitter to a website that you can actually only get through a domain. Like, so instead of going to abc.com, you had to type in .992.15 whatever. And it was home to what the website's title was World Class Investigative Truth. And it was run by a man named Jim Stone, who self-described as a deplorable freelance journalist, right, playing on that moniker that was used during the election. And so he captioned the top portion, "Newsweek just shipped. My original report on this was accurate. They really are going to steal it," right, implying that Newsweek was part of a rigging of the election. And so my students and I were like, well, why? Where did this picture come from? Why is it being circulated? What is behind this? And we found, and I explained why this would happen, that there was actually two magazine covers, right? One says President Trump, and the other says Madame President. Why would Newsweek produce two covers? Does anyone know? Yeah, because just for financial reasons, like even during like the Super Bowl or the World Series, both teams win, right? And you put out the t-shirt or the hat the next day for whatever event actually happens, and normally the remainder of the merchandise gets shipped to a developing country, which is why you'll see sometimes random pictures on the internet of, you know, the Packers winning every Super Bowl when they didn't, you know, they didn't. And so Newsweek, like many media companies, printed two. But this turned into a false news story because you could see where one photo was taken, selectively framed in a different context in order to generate a particular news story. And so this happens a lot. And just a fair warning, the next image that's going to pop up, it is not real blood. Just so no one's like alarmed. This person is fine, she was not harmed, not blood. So this was from a Facebook group I follow called Conservative Nation, and it says, here's what happened to a female Trump supporter when she met peaceful, intolerant liberals. And so this was kind of evoking all of the stuff we heard at various campaign rallies of protesters of all stripes and all sides. But the problem was, this was actually from a makeup artist's Facebook page, and she works on a zombie show called Ash vs. Evil Dead on Netflix. And so she put this on Facebook, and it was plucked and put into a different context. And again, this isn't something, this is just a Conservative Nation example, but this happens across the political spectrum. This one also I had seen some of my friends circulating, and my students had showed me, because I teach at a Catholic college, so they're very interested in sort of Christian and Catholic news issues. And I was shown this picture, breaking tens of thousands of fraudulent Clinton votes found in Ohio warehouse, right? And this looks, you know, we tend to think about photographs as very convincing because there's visual proof of something. But the problem is that this was actually from the Birmingham Mail, so a UK news organization, and they were ballot boxes for an actual election. But again, the photo was taken out of context and used for someone's political purposes, right? To try to generate excitement and shares. Because the more you can get people excited about something, and that's easy to do, right? There's tons of real stuff that we can all be excited about and angry about, and this feeds into that even more. And so we have these kind of decontextualized things that I've been talking about. We have satire, and then the imposter content. And so the headline on this is insane. So the picture below Donald Trump says, Donald Trump to build a wall out of the homes for American war veterans. Like, who would believe this, right? But it looks like NBC, right? They designed the website as an imposter to NBC News. And there's all kinds just like this. Similarly, and here's where I'm going to start being mean to traditional journalists, fake news can also come in the form of news aggregation gone wrong. So, like I was just saying, there's more news outlets than have ever existed, and most of it gets funneled through Facebook. And so, where once we would pay for news content and they would have advertising, now less of us are willing to pay, and advertising content is being spread across more and more different news orgs. So they have a lot less money and a lot more pressure to use these platforms to generate advertising revenue. And so because of this, you have a lot less investigative journalism, foreign correspondence, you don't have newspapers in as many small communities, and this is all a huge problem. And similarly, it also makes journalists and editors have to rely more on secondary reporting. And so sometimes this means taking something from the AP Newswire or re-reporting on something that's already happened. Sometimes this means reporting on a random Google Doc that someone made for her class, or a tweet, or whatever it may be. So my favorite example of this is from the Florida Sun Post. And the headline says, "Miami man discovers bride is his own granddaughter. No plans to divorce." Sorry, I got so excited. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of like the Florida man joke, but basically Florida man is this long-running, like Florida man gets eaten by a gator while bowling. It's just, Florida news is really quite strange in general. The problem with this is that the Florida Sun Post is not a news organization. So like the Denver Guardian before, it was a website someone created to generate advertising revenue. So that in itself is not a problem. The problem is several news organizations, AOL, Fox, Complex Magazine, dozens of others, all picked up this story and reported on it. And it never happened. And so that's an example where, you know, I talked about how people were distrusting news less. Well, here's one reason why. That isn't even about political perceptions of bias, but about, well, what's happening, how can we rely on what kind of information we're getting. And the next one's a little bit closer to home. Some of you may have actually read about this. So the story goes, someone tweeted this picture, a screen grab from their television, and said, CNN is straight up porn right now. What happened to Parts Unknown CNN? And so the story went that instead of airing Anthony Bourdain's Parts Unknown, which is a food sort of travel show, that CNN was hacked and airing pornography. And this was the visual evidence provided by the person on Twitter. So this story was picked up by The Independent, which is a UK news organization, and guess what? It took off from there. Oops, CNN's Boston TV channel accidentally broadcast 30 minutes of porn. One tweet then turned into, viewers left stunned after CNN TV channel accidentally broadcast 30 minutes of porn. And so this was replicated all over, and I was like frantically trying to screen grab all of this before it changed, because here's another example where it actually wasn't true. So this was a hoax that was tweeted out, and it's very unfortunate when you have even Fox 25 Boston reported on this story on their online edition, and who did they cite as their source? The Independent. So they were citing an international news organization for something that had happened in their own backyard. And again, they would also say that that's a problem, and that's the result of not having enough money to cover it. And it took an independent journalist, Luke O'Neill, who's from the area, to finally contact RCN, CNN, and everyone involved to find out, no, this did not happen. And so these definitely are huge problems when it comes to false news, and definitely further destabilizes, what people can trust and who they can trust. And so when people talk about these problems and they ask me, like, well, what should the solution be? And I'll say, well, people like me need to actually read what they're sharing on Facebook, but also news organizations need to do their due diligence. Google needs to make sure that the first Google News item isn't someone's random blog, that it's actually a news organization. And it's also important to know that fake or false news can circulate in other forms as well. And so I'm sure some of you have seen the image on the left, like just images with facts on them scrolling through Facebook. And so Occupy Democrats is a group that circulates a lot. saying, lowest jobless claims in 42 years, strongest dollar in 12, cheapest gas in 11. Of course, there are no sources to this. It's cherry-picked data. There's no context provided. But people will share this. Like, yeah, if you were a fan of Obama, you're going to share it. If you're not a fan of Obama, you're going to be like, where are the sources? Where's the data coming from? And so that's another way in which false information can spread. Then the one on the right, very tiny. So I'll read the tweet to you. Trump won around 40% of the Latino vote in Nevada, but this accounts for about 1,300 votes, still more than 2 Hispanics on the ballot. Tweet 2. Trump won around 40% of the Latino vote in Nevada. That accounts for about 1,300 votes, still more than the 2 Hispanics on the ballot. Tweet 3. Trump won around 40% of the Latino vote. These are all different Twitter accounts, but they're not actual people. They're bots. They're created to circulate news or facts or news that might appeal to different groups of people. And so this is another way in which you can flood social media with information that is not correct. And so you have all these different examples of false news circulating. And when I was focusing so much on the Florida Sun Post and all these other sources, people were sending me this picture. I received this in my email multiple times, and that these are actually weapons of mass deception. And so I don't totally agree. I think we have to think about intent, right? So the main difference between the Twitter bots and these kinds of news organizations, and this is picking totally on television news mostly, is that one is trying to mislead you, and the other frequently makes more mistakes than they should. And that's a problem, and they need to be held accountable. But whereas the Twitter bots aren't going to apologize or print a retraction or change their social media accounts, these organizations generally will. And so this all feeds into sort of a media sphere that gets very crowded and very complicated, and also very polarized. So this is very hard to read, like I can barely read it on my screen, but it's to capture where the primary news information was originating from over the last 6 months. And this was analyzing almost 1 million different articles and where they were being circulated. And so it found if you identified more to the left, you were sharing primarily from CNN, New York Times. Everybody apparently circulates The Hill, which is a right-leaning publication. And then the most common circulator of news on the right, most people would say Fox News, but it was actually, over the last 6 months, Breitbart. And then what you can see the bigger circles sort of act as nodes. And as I was trying to demonstrate, sometimes news jumps from a false website to a real one and then circles off again. And so it becomes this very complex way to understand how information is circulated and what should we do about it. And so knowing all this and all these examples I'm talking to you, I decided I was going to try to help my students figure this out. And so me and a group of librarians analyzed almost 1,000 different websites in an attempt to categorize them by whether they were false news or satire or other kinds of content. So I'm also very interested in websites that have headlines like, how to lose 10 pounds in 10 days via a miracle drug or whatever. I'm like, sign me up. But that's also a kind of false news, right? And so we came up with a list of what we would look at in order to categorize all these different bubbles in the sphere to how to assess like whether the Florida Sun Post is a reliable source, it's not, or whether, Denver Guardian is reliable. And so we were looking at the domain itself. So how do you know if something's an imposter website? Well, the domain, the URL that you go to, that what you type in to get there, NBC.com, is important. Oftentimes these false news sites don't have any authors, so normally if you read the Boston Globe, there's a byline, right? It'll say, this is who wrote it. On a lot of false stories on like the Florida Sun Post, that doesn't happen. We also looked at what kinds of sources these organizations were citing, analyzed their writing style. So I was just making fun of how even, traditional news organizations use not so great headlines, but I started finding across very politically motivated spheres on both sides of the aisle that certain terms were showing up frequently. And so if you see terms like so-and-so eviscerated someone or slaughtered them, I mean, honestly, those two words show up so often, you would think just walking down the street there would be guts everywhere for how often that seems to happen. So looking at the kind of language that's used, how are they being framed on social media, all of these other things. And it was still incredibly difficult to determine whether something is real news, false news, or somewhere in between. So how do you determine this without going through a multi-step process every single time you come across something on Facebook? Like, I'm not even willing to do that in my everyday life. So what's the answer? We can talk about that in the end. So again, I created this document that went very viral, and I came up with a few tips after analyzing almost 1,000 different websites. And those tips are as follows. So one, the biggest one, and I already mentioned, is that there isn't an author mentioned. There's lack of publisher or publication information. So even though all of these news organizations primarily exist virtually, usually there's at least a P.O. box or somewhere that you can send physical mail to them. If you can't find anything like that, usually that's a bad sign. So I was kind of, Breitbart and Emilionopolis, they still have a mailing address. That's important. All caps, so normally you're not going to see Forbes or the Wall Street Journal, slaughter, all caps, question marks, exclamation points. That's not going to happen. But it will across these other news organizations. Loaded language. And so one thing I haven't talked about yet is why they might use such loaded language. Well, if we're coming across everything on social media, if you're flooded with information, what are you actually going to click on? Something that makes you really happy? Something that makes you really angry? If something is sort of lukewarm, you're probably not inspired to engage with it. And so when you use really loaded language, people get mad, and then they're more likely to click, and that's more likely to generate advertising revenue. And so when you see very loaded language, usually that's a sign to sort of do what I call like a gut check. Like, why am I mad? Is it telling me I should be mad? Because if it is, that's usually not the greatest sign, right? And I'm, again, not saying that there isn't plenty to be mad about, but there are attempts by false news to try to purposely make you mad so they can make more money. Grammar mistakes and typos are pretty rampant. Also, the reliance on images like these, which are called digital-born images. So usually if, you can tell everything was created by a computer, and this can be tricky. I mean, hopefully no one thinks that this was something that a photographer actually captured, but it's possible, right? But these would be the kinds of images that you'd be most likely to see on false news sites. And here's where it gets tricky too. So all secondary reporting. So it's highly unlikely that they would cite an interview with someone. They would be most likely in straight up false news to cite other sources, or most commonly to keep citing themselves. So why would a false news organization hyperlink itself over and over again as a source? Because they want you to click on it to generate more advertising revenue. So trying to suck you in and just keep you reading in their little media sphere. And so all of these, I lost the slide. I wanted to go back to this. And so part of what I've been going around trying to do is to complicate how we just say fake news is either news we disagree with or just completely false news, right? Just made up out of nowhere. In fact, it exists in shades of gray. And while, a lot of journalists and scholars and computer programmers are very concerned about false news, actually we need to think with a little bit more care about the kinds of news that actually exist in what Stephen Colbert once called a truthy sphere. So not the outright satire, which is easy to recognize, or even some of these hoaxes, but instead the news that is much more like this, or like this, where it's very hard to tell because you have facts interspersed with untruths or lies. And so my tips, unfortunately, aren't going to help you go through all of, unless you fact check it yourself. And so the best thing that I can say, or what I try to do, is to do what media scholars call triangulate, and what librarians often teach students as well. And so that just means to read as much as possible, and by reading multiple sources, hopefully you kind of zero in on what actually happened. And honestly, that's the best thing that you can do beyond just actually reading what you're sharing. Yeah. Does anyone have any, I was hoping someone would interrupt me in the middle, but does anyone have any questions or concerns or comments? Yeah. Yes, yeah.
Which is where you have an expert from one side, which is represented by 3% of the people who believe something, and then 97% of the people who believe the other thing. Like you have a UFO expert, and then you have someone from NASA say no way. And because it's presented as fair and balanced, they're being fair and balanced, they're presenting both points of view. It looks like 50%, these are equally possible. Yeah, there's a 3% chance that there are UFOs, but nobody ever says that there's a 3% chance that there are UFOs. That only 3% of the people who have anything in their head believe there are UFOs, and that 97% don't. And
yeah,
it's on TV all the time.
It is, and it's been a part of sort of, I guess, journalism for a long time, when part of communication policy was something called the fairness doctrine. So the idea that public broadcasters or broadcasters like ABC, NBC, who use generally the public airwaves, which is a utility that no one can own. And so for access to those airwaves, they had to make sure that when they had one political perspective on in particular, that it was balanced by the other side. And this generally became sort of an exaggerated form of that in what you're referring to as false equivalence or false balance, where everything has another side. But as most people know, sometimes there is only one side of a fact, right? A fact really can't have sides, but more importantly than that actually, is more often there are 5 sides, right? Or there are multiple sides, and we tend to boil everything down to one side versus another. And that's an overly simplistic understanding of how news or information in general works. And so that is a huge problem. And I think that if we're critiquing sort of contemporary journalism and its role in false news, that would be another way in which a lot of misinformation has been circulated that probably shouldn't be. But then that gets very tricky too. And one reason why that still happens, if so many people distrust news, and the main reason they cite is because they believe it to be politically biased, then that's one way they can try to be like, no, we're not. See, two sides to everything. And again, I think most of us are much more complex than just 2 sides to every story. So that's a really great point. Yeah.
Snopes, S-N-O-P-E-S.
Yeah, sure, that's right. They found out they were biased.
They
were all the people they were giving the wrong information.
Yeah, and so that gets another tricky layer. So Facebook, part of why Facebook became such a source for false news being circulated is because they actually fired their news team because of perceptions that Facebook was politically biased. And so when they turned it over to algorithms or robots, then you started seeing a lot more junk coming back in. And so now that everyone's like, come on, Facebook, this is unacceptable, they started pairing with third-party fact checkers. So Snopes, factcheck.org, Poynter, and others. But the problem is, For a lot of people, they will say that the fact checkers themselves are biased, right? That they are part of the problem. And so how do you reach people then who who first don't trust the original articles or do, and then the debunking or the fact checking just leads to further distrust. And that's where you really get into Pizzagate territory too, when you feel like, I mean, when you go from being skeptical, right? We should all be skeptical of the information we come across. That's healthy, and that makes us keep reading and be cautious. But then what we've really become is cynical, where we just don't trust anything. And when I ask my students which news organizations they turn to, the answer, and this frightens me, is none of them, right? And it's partially because of what you're saying. Yeah.
So I'm wondering what you think about George Lakoff and his belief that we only take in and believe what already fits our pre-programmed worldview.
Yeah.
It makes sense why somebody's always looking for alternative facts to be facts. You know, and have two sides, facts and alternative facts.
Yeah.
Yeah,
so that's a really great point. So there's a lot of talk about confirmation bias as related to this notion of filter bubbles, right? And so confirmation bias is this psychological understanding of why we tend to seek out information we already agree with, and similarly, why if someone says, well, no, that information isn't correct, it actually just makes us dig in a little bit more oftentimes. We're not convinced by someone telling us, no, it's actually not right. We're like, no, you're not right? And so we have this kind of desire to be right. But as I think most people know, that's one way to approach information, but I'm sure most of us have had our minds changed in some context, right? So it's not an all the time hard and fast rule, but it does influence what we might click on Facebook, and then what we might click on further generates seeing more of that same thing, right? And that's where the notion of filter bubble comes in. And so this also gets sometimes oversimplified. So the idea of a filter bubble is because social media, where we're getting most of our news, adapts and learns from our behaviors, it just keeps giving us more and more and more of what we want. And honestly, this has been a problem in traditional journalism for a long time, when journalists and news organizations were expected to turn an ever-increasing profit. There was more giving to us that we want, right? Goat parades, rather than what we might need to make informed decisions. And so social media just intensifies this phenomenon. And so a lot of people have argued that results in blue Facebook, where you have sort of everyone who's on the left circulating from certain news sites, and they're never seeing stuff that's circulated on the right. So the one issue with this, a lot of new media scholars have empirically shown this to be somewhat exaggerated. And anecdotally, so I'm very open about my politics. I'm left-leaning, but I come from a very conservative family. I already said my grandmother is conservative Catholic. My parents are. I see the same stuff they post because I engage with their content otherwise. So I also see the news content they come across. Also, we all don't just exist online, right? I come in contact with my students all the time, many of whom are conservative or liberal. And so we have these filter bubbles, but we don't only exist in those bubbles. So we may be more likely to see stuff we agree with, but I think many of us know that's not all we see, right? So it's very influential, but we have to, remember that's not all we're coming across, and it's important, back up. But it's still, even though it's not as pervasive as some journalists report it as, we still have to be cognizant of what we're sharing. So I personally read daily newspaper and political magazines from across the political spectrum, because I want to know how stories are being framed everywhere. And so it's kind of up to us to try to challenge and that doesn't mean I'm going to read something I disagree with and be like, change my mind. I might dig in further because I'm a flawed creature like the rest of us, but at least trying to step outside of our boundaries. Yeah.
First of all, as a fellow academic, I really appreciate your classifications, getting away from
Yeah.
I think it's a very useful exercise to get at the range.
A continuum.
Also, I think that's a very important contribution to the way we think about information more than news itself.
Yeah.
That's really good. Let me give you something to think about. None of this is all that surprising.
No.
You always have your initial open page show. At first, you had it right. You hit the nail right on the head. And this is what information does. This is profit margin thinking. Given that, what has changed? I suggest you two things. Simply volume and fall back to my generation, including myself, Marshall Bloom. The structure itself shapes what is projected out. Push that argument further. You're now into what, in my own work, I call the tyranny of adjectives. And newspapers have to do that simply in structural constraint. And not only that, once they do that, if you identify, say, a position, a politician, the first thing they do is to say R for Republican, D for Democrat. Once you do that, you have destroyed the objective reality of the news, because people are not going to shape the issue. And this is exactly, so it's a structural problem. That has not changed. And that is not about to change, which poses a problem for somebody like you and me who's engaging in this kind of information processing. For a student, for example, in my class, my students, it's a categorical entry strong position.
Yep.
They're called Wikipedia. It's an automatic effort. It's an automatic effort. I simply do not solve. How can we train the analytic mind how to do that? Not only answer.
Oh yeah. So, yeah, and so I'm in my training as a critical scholar, and so I exist all the time in a world that is very contingent and contextual and all about deconstructing sort of binaries, which is why I've been arguing against oversimplifying as a writer left, and I agree with a lot of your points, right? Volume, like the medium, right? Referencing McLuhan, also just the speed of sharing, like when we come across an article, everything's article based rather than when you got a newspaper, you would usually read all of it. And so that's a different mode of consumption. So we have different production and consumption issues. And so I guess what I try to teach my students is like, I mean, I guess in a way I'm part of the problem, right? Because I'm one of the people that probably over too long of teaching has created distrust in journalists because I'm highly critical of what they do. And by trying to show how we create these binaries that don't really hold. But it is important to trust in something, which is why I think a lot of scientists are saying, well, there's literally no such thing as an alternative fact, right? There are facts. You can't have alternative facts. Like there's, like epistemologically it can't exist. That's not something that can exist. And so I feel like it's just what I do every day, so it's hard to describe. But I think making people feel comfortable in sort of that contingency, basically, to get more academic. I don't know if that answers your question, Ewan. What field are you in? Okay, yeah.
Yeah, but the question is, say, if you can frame the issue of making people I don't want to make people my job is not to make people My job as a scholar is to destroy everything facing That is my job. And if I've done my job, they should go home and think about basic things that they thought they morally might be simply not.
Yeah, or how what we determine as morally right is contingent and it changes over time. Yeah, and so I think that's what I teach my students as well.
How's that working
I have no sympathy.
But have you seen change happen?
At 0.001%.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, it's scary, like the George Lakoff interview on YouTube with Pat Smiley.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Smiley saying like, yeah, but once Trump's in the White House and he gets all this information and this intelligence, certainly that could change his worldview. And Lakoff saying, no, I don't think so.
78-year-old man changing his
Yeah.
worldview.
So what I want to know is, where's the tipping point?
Mhm.
Where is it still flexible enough that we can make a difference in creating critical thinkers?
Maybe.
Well, the way I look at it is what you're saying, is with the people and the leaders, all right, who are making decisions. And I think they're making bad decisions. And I'll use just a small example. There's Mike Monique, right, who was grabbed for plagiarism.
Mm-hmm.
Someone in that industry made a decision to put him on a TV show every morning. That woman that writes history books, good one. She was grabbed for plagiarism. You see her back in with the professionals. I see her on public television. All right, so these are people in the business. As far as I'm concerned, hiring a bad cop. If a cop is doing it, he's going to be doing it all his life. And that's the way I look at it. The people who are in the industry create this problem. And of course, the regular folk, they just see what we don't know. Like, I don't know if it's true or false.
Mhm.
When I see it, because I happened to pay attention to that years ago when it happened.
Mm-hmm.
Do all athletes take performance enhancing
Well, see, that doesn't bother me. It's not a game.
But you don't think this is a business?
Huh? News is a business, and this is the key.
Yeah.
Like they want to split perception that they've given us facts.
Yeah. And so
They just give us the other day, it's all perception.
And so one thing I would say, so what I try to teach my students even, so when you said the term like elitist, so I would, in a classroom, I would be like, well, so what do we mean by that term? And so when my news thing went viral, right, so depending on where you were in the political spectrum, some people were like, oh, it's just another like liberal elite who lives in the Boston area telling us what's real or fake. Right? And I was like, oh, I don't feel like an elite. Like, I have a ton of student debt and I live in a crappy apartment. Drive a 10-year-old Honda. Very elite. I know. And so there was that, right? So, like, because I'm a tenure track professor and, like, living in this area, that meant elite. But then, simultaneously, other people were like, well, she's at a small liberal arts college. Like, who is she? Like, she doesn't know. She's not at Harvard, right? And so there was, like, this simultaneous denigration and accusations of elitism. And it was completely dependent on the perception of who was making the charges against me. And so, like, even what we mean by those terms, I try to show my students can sometimes be contextual and, different depending on point of view. Yeah.
Such a fascinating and complicated topic. Melissa, I wondered what your opinion is about something that I think is just now starting to happen. And I guess I wonder if you think it's a good thing or not. So somebody has gotten hold of your list,
Mhm.
list that has all caps, and if there's typos, and if there's no author ID, then we'll call that fake news.
I know where you're going.
Facebook is creating an algorithm that will automatically suppress that
Mhm.
fake news so that you'll never see it. Is that a good thing, a bad thing, or what?
Yeah, and so one thing we have to remember, so oftentimes people raise this question. I think it's a very important question. And so my first reaction is actually, already we're not seeing a ton of information. We're seeing a very small amount of the information that we're looking for. So Google and Facebook have been doing that for a really long time. And so I think part of the issue is transparency over what we're seeing or not seeing, right? So I've spoken publicly that I'm very anti any kind of blocking or censorship. I don't think, like fake news, most of it has a right to exist, right? It's legally protected speech most of the time. It's protected in the same way that tabloids have been for a long time. That, you know, the defense is normally, well, no one would believe that, you know, X, I'm thinking of like, you know, Penthouse and all of those things, you know, when they were doing political things. And it's like, well, no one would believe that would actually happen. So the same thing, no one would actually believe that that's an official photo of Hillary Clinton and her alien baby. What? You know it's not. I mean, maybe it is. And so that's part of it. So I would say no. But I think I think part of what at least people say to me is like, they're not sure how to assess it. And so that's where I think, or I'm working with several people to create a sort of dual system. And so Facebook right now is trying to be like, well, you can report something if you believe that it's false news. There's two problems with that already. And so some people who have been mobilized to say CNN is fake news or false news are now reporting every CNN story on Facebook as false news. And then you, of course, have actual false news being flagged and all of that. And so I think it becomes very messy. But I still think it's useful. So what I would want to see, instead of a report that goes nowhere, like tell me that it's being flagged. Who is flagging it? Why? Right? Give us the information about what is being determined. And so that's what I try to advocate for. And in fact, I'm working with another librarian group right now. So instead of just saying, well, this website is a noted conspiracy website, instead, you would click on something on Facebook and it would go through like steps with the user. So like, where did this image come from? Like, can you find links to other articles? So it actually walks you through a process to determine for yourself whether you find it reliable based on, you know, librarians and their expertise in assessing information. The problem is with that, most people, myself included, are probably not going to want to do that very often, if at all. And so then I think that goes back to your point, well then what do we do? How can we exist in a world where we at least agree on a sort of shared reality, even if it is contingent and contextual and whatever? And that's...
If we thought that Facebook was not just a platform,
Yeah.
Then we actually expect them to use some metrics of quality, right? We want them to suppress the bad news, put the low quality junk so far down we'll never see it, and show us only the good relevant content. So shouldn't we want Facebook to be a publisher, since that's the function that they're having in our society now?
Yeah.
What's so bad about thinking about Facebook as a publisher?
And so a lot of media scholars have actually started pushing for that as not necessarily a publisher, but thinking about Facebook as a media company. So one that is primarily, you know, existing for the circulation of information. And when we understand it that way, then I think that it requires sort of different practices and perhaps more transparency in how information is being assessed. And so again, I think the tricky part is, even if we think about it that way, we're still already not seeing most of what other people on our feeds are sharing, right? Because everything is, you know, if you go to like top news, you're seeing a small fraction of what's actually being posted. And so what aren't we seeing? Can we have access to it? And I think that's what some people are asking for. So we think about it as a publisher, well, what information is published that we are being denied? And I think that could be an important step in figuring it out.
We don't expect that same transparency of a newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
The Boston Globe gets lots of tips and leads and information that it determines is it going to go in the newspaper, and nobody complains about that.
But I don't say Facebook is a publisher. I say Facebook is a bad guy. Friends, because I'm looking at, I talk to people, like you said, you've got people 92 years old.
Mm-hmm.
All right, and they use it to communicate all over the country, and that's like talking over the old clothesline.
Yep.
And that's the way I look at it in my generation. I don't look, and that's how, and a lot of them, it opens there because they couldn't talk to people.
Mhm.
And they show them how to do Facebook, and they show them this, and you're talking to them every day, and you're talking to this one, and then another one that they went to school with, they get involved in the conversation. I don't see it as a publication, I just see it as a entertainment for people, because
Yeah. And that's a great point.
everything we started at, but I think
But
now,
just like gossip,
gossip.
but just like gossip can actually hurt people.
Oh, yeah, it could help.
Yeah.
That are,
But I think you're raising a really important point, though. So, like, Facebook has even tried to emphasize its non-news role. So now if you just post an update, right, it's all like a colorful background to try to highlight that in your feed to emphasize the interpersonal communication instead of the news stuff. And so I think, yeah, that's true, yeah. So, but when the letters become very large, you know how they were doing that for a while when it was like, if it's short enough. But I think you raise a good point. So it's a news platform, publisher in a sense, although again, we can't necessarily, we have to think about it differently because there isn't an editor we can contact for a correction or, you know what I mean? Like we're not necessarily giving Facebook tips. They're not producing the content. They're a distributor more so than a publisher, I guess. Yeah, curator. But then people also, so there's a segment of the population that primarily uses Facebook for games, like Zynga games, Farmville, Candy Crush, etc., and for interpersonal communication. So it's multiple roles, and so you can't, and it varies a lot by age group how people are primarily using it. Did you have a comment too that I interrupted? Yeah.
Yeah, I anticipate just you will First Amendment. However, danger, threat, if you read the news, is the best.
Mm-hmm.
Sinclair,
Yes.
lying down, small stations. That represents far greater threat to information. And it is making Fox News, you know,
I know Sinclair. Mm-hmm.
in your face competition with Fox News. And if they're flying up those small stations, especially in the Midwest and in the South, they're going to flood very preemptive pre-selection information. That to me is a far greater threat to freedom of information.
Yeah, and I think that raises, so, I mean, ownership has long been an issue, right, in thinking about who owns the media that's being produced. And I think that's why, like, the only antidote to that is like, all right, well, now we have all of these local affiliates being owned by one company. The same thing happens in radio. So, okay, well, I still might watch that local news channel, but I'm also going to listen to NPR, and I'm also going to buy a subscription to a newspaper. And so, I mean, the only thing that we really can do is try to financially support and make sure that we're, you know, and we cross our fingers that it's actually going into the news creation rather than to the profit margin. But yeah, I think there's a weird sense that a lot of communication scholars have right now that things are starting to get better and simultaneously much worse. And I think you're pointing to an example where things feel like they're getting worse, where information is becoming increasingly concentrated to a smaller and smaller number of people, while at the same time you have more independent sources than ever, but they may not subscribe to traditional editorial processes or fact-checking, and what does that mean? Does that mean, you know, is it still reliable? Yes and no. And at the same time, subscription rates for regional newspapers are going up. Donations to independent, nonprofit, like investigative organizations are going up. I did a talk at a high school in the area, and students there were like, well, I look at like Deutsche Welle and BBC, and they were turning towards international sources of news to try to understand the US. And so I feel like even the fact that a bunch of, over 100 high school students would be like, I want to learn about news, is unique. And I think that gives me some hope that, you know, people care. Well, that's a whole can of worms.
Actually, I'm going to disagree with you.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Why I disagree with you?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and what happened? Facebook went up. Facebook, you have to more people in a short period of time than any other type of media that we had over the past 50 years. And if they wouldn't grab all this stuff, I believe in the children that you are educating, and they'll come up with something that'll spread the whole thing. And all these people with all this big money and these big corporations will lose it, and you'll start up again. The only thing you have to worry about is trying to put a muzzle. Trying to put a muzzle on this creative stuff. Like they did for years, they couldn't do certain things on the television. For example, some of the old people might hear, but by the way, is up until what, in the 80s, you couldn't have political speech on the radio. I think
Yeah, without it being balanced, so then that's why you didn't have it as often.
they wouldn't have the people talk. You can't get it balanced when it's people talking. And they've tried different mechanisms, but talk radio is to a certain point now. And of course now that's straightened up because they're all going into the internet.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's
And I think you're raising two really important points, actually. And so one is how, how when media supplants other kinds of media. And so I'm from Wisconsin. I lived in Milwaukee for a long time. And we think about, well, what is Facebook doing to traditional news organizations? Not helping them in a lot of ways. So the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel is the primary daily paper in Milwaukee. It's been struggling for years and is highly likely that it will close in the next couple of years, which means that a city the same size as Boston proper won't have a newspaper at all. And so how will that increase trust between people and journalists when there's no journalists covering their city besides like some alt weeklies, etc.? So that's a huge problem. Conservative talk radio is already reckoning with that as stuff becomes more digital, online sources.
look at the real estate industry. Let's go back to
Yeah. Yeah, but I think also I think it's a cycle though. So when cable news, like when you looked at it historically, there was a greater and this is CNN, Fox, across the board, right? You looked at it, content over the years, and there was a greater division between news and punditry. But as cable has been challenged more by online sources, that line has blurred substantially. And this is the same thing that you'll see even in newspapers. So, for example, the Washington Post. For a long time, if there was an opinion piece shared on Facebook, it looked like a regular news story. It didn't say perspective or opinion. And so, of course, you're going to see that and be like, well, that's biased, or that's an opinion, that's not news. And it was improperly labeled. And cable news has been doing that a lot too. Like, are all of the talking heads news journalists? No, they're pundits. But that tends to generate ratings more than straight news reporting when you have a really competitive market. And so that further makes people distrust them, which might shed more viewers.
So see, we'll go back to the Boston Globe again.
Mhm.
You might have studied this because I think you're too young for it. We didn't really tell you the truth, but it wasn't that long ago. It was a reporter for the Boston Globe. She's a news reporter. And what happened is she put an opinion piece saying her voice in her stories weren't being heard. She's supposed to be reporting the news, not giving an opinion.
Mhm.
And of course, all the journalists, they went after her. I remember reading the story. It was around for a few years. But I think it moved, like you're saying,
Mhm.
from like straight news to opinion pieces and then push it off.
Yeah, and do you want to know why we're seeing way more opinion produced by news organizations on social media? Cheaper, right? You don't have to have a team going out to the fire, like in another city, to cover it. You write your opinion. Also, that tends to circulate better on social media because it can create an emotional reaction with people. Yeah. So that's why you're seeing so much more opinion, and then the news gets smaller and smaller and blurrier. And I always try to end, though, by saying, like, even though I'm highly critical of media, like, I still get daily Boston Globe in the mail. I subscribe to the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. Like, I still think we have to have some faith, skeptical faith, in these institutions while, exposing ourselves as widely as possible. Because if we don't, like, what binds us? What can we turn to be informed? I don't know. No. Yeah. Yes.
How does fake news influence your life as an individual?
And that's the thing, actually. I would argue, like, false news, like, the problem in general is, like, false news proper, just completely made up, probably doesn't impact us very much as individuals. What does impact us much more would be sort of the longer history of, like, propaganda and stuff that exists in that gray area where you can't really tell if it, like, the mix of fact and fiction and misleading content. And that, I think, actually has a very profound impact on us. And there's decades of research in political science and communication that supports that. And I still think we don't always have the best antidotes or tools to manage it, because countering it, even in communication, tends not to be very effective.
And I'll give you two examples. Number one is the pizza place that you were talking about.
Yeah.
People on the side.
Mm-hmm.
But number two is something most people here will think is a very dangerous piece of equipment. And what I'll say is what we call the football track vaccine. Because after a $1 million campaign back in the 90s from the Humane Society, it showed that piece of equipment was inhumane. But the instrument they used was a dog with no leg, and he lost it in a car accident. But they used that equipment to move endangered species all over the country. And that's the only piece of equipment doing what they all, but if you turn around and say football trap, oh, that's terrible.
Mm-hmm.
But that's how, like you're saying, fake news.
It's that mix, right? Yep, where it's not, I think, what we all kind of agree on, it's not just black and white, one side versus the other, then in fact we are in a very contingent and contextual time, and so we just need to expose ourselves as much as possible, and recognizing a lot of what you're all saying.
Yeah, I feel like one of the big points that keeps coming back to me is the issue of volume, right?
Mm-hmm.
Back then, so much more information available, and yet in the way in which we consume, we actually consume less. Like all those people who read just the headlines and not the article, whereas if they read the whole article, they would pick up on a lot of those clues that you highlight. And that's
Mm-hmm.
high school students, that's for sure something we see all the time, right? They just look at tiny snippets. They're used to like little text messages and whatnot. And Twitter,
Mm-hmm.
entire article.
Yeah, and even like television shows now are created with what producers call click culture. So how can we take out 30-second bits to circulate on social media to generate, more interest? And so some people refer to it as snackable culture. And so even some news organizations have been trying to figure out how to adapt to that kind of shortness.
The way cable news looks, right, is that you have like 3 different tickers and something happening up here, and you may not be focused on any of the actual story that you're getting,
Mm-hmm.
just this little headline in isolation.
I know. It makes me very nostalgic for like that long read that I can just, that's one thing on a screen or one thing in my hands. But just, yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. Yeah, or but any, you know what I mean, like anyone. Yeah.
Back in the 60s, both the Annenberg School and Columbia University did wonderful studies on the impact of consumption as the old 30-minute news
Mhm.
started with 30.5 minutes and then kept going down. And a nice comparison, they did a series of studies on people who consume the news through journalists, Newsweek, Time, and those things. And the evidence was very clear that those folks who received the news from television, the amount of information and then setting of context was considerably lower.
Yep.
And what I want to ask you
Yeah, and sometimes it's, so one thing I'll say, so television news in communication studies has often been denigrated, right, as not a very good medium for informing people, but when we're talking about satire and like false, that kind of false news, actually people who used to watch like The Daily Show, and this was a study that's 10 years old, they were more informed about current events and more accurately informed than non-watchers, right? So we can get information in news from sources that seem unlikely, but I haven't seen very much about retention and like context for this kind of snackable culture that you're talking about. Preliminary stuff that I've seen seems to show that there's not a huge difference, but part of the problem is that there's not necessarily good comparison like source that you can draw from, right? So it's like, yeah. I mean, it's very complicated, but I haven't seen a lot on that yet.
Sorry, to speak to that satirical issue, like John Oliver's show now,
Mhm.
obviously like a very like left-leaning show, really current, and yet like they're doing long form investigative journalism, which is really interesting, and they're able to do like a single issue and a full episode in a way that you don't get a lot.
Yeah, and you're also seeing like even some like news magazines do, like reinvesting in the long read online. I think because people are getting increasingly annoyed with everything being short and in their face or whatever, and so like I think you'll start to see that balance out as people get increasingly tired of some of the phenomenons that you're talking about. Phenomena.
I hope you're correct here, because I get a little nervous with this satire, especially in the recent forays, because when you go back to the Greeks, all right, in Germany, that's what they do to equalize the Jews. They use the crimes, the punishment, because people retain that faster and quicker. And that's what makes me nervous with this negative stuff, the satire. It's only satire. That's what they said back in the 30s.
Yeah, satire can be very salient. Mhm.
That's why I just leave it nervous. People don't see it, and that can build up, like you said, over a period of time.
Mhm. Yeah, and even just repeated exposure to the same false information, non-satirical, can actually build up over time, and we don't even really remember, like, whether we even questioned it in the beginning or not. So,
Like music, you hate it when you first hear it, but if you hear it enough, you
yeah,
start
the
liking it.
earworm. Mm-hmm.
That's what the fellow said. He says, if you feel alive, he said, don't go with the small one, go with the big one. Because you'll bleed the big one faster than you'll bleed the small one. Who is that, Lois?
I think so.
So, final thoughts for us, Dr. Zimbardi.
Final thoughts on Goebbels. I mean, I guess.
We can't end with them.
No, we can't end with Goebbels. I guess my final thought would be sort of playing on a point you made, is being increasingly comfortable with not knowing 100%, but being okay with knowing a solid 80% that you can like trust what you are reading, and to keep holding journalists accountable for what they're doing. So if we think about tech solutions, individual behaviors with what we are reading past that first paragraph or past that headline, and then finally rewarding good work and making sure we speak up when we see bad work. And really that's the only way that if we start having good information breaking through the clutter, that we can maybe put a dent or highlight all within this volume of misinformation. Mm-hmm.
They have to do it. I mean, it's important. They come up and they ask you something that they saw. Go and find out and see what you think, come back and tell me what you found out. That's what I try to tell people. I mean, for an example, I saw something in Ireland. It was just a small article. It was a woman like Dolly Cobb.
Mm-hmm.
All right? And what happened is I researched it, and it was a terrible, terrible thing that happened. But it was good that it come out because we got to send our police department over to Ireland to straighten it out. That's why this guy from Boston went.
Mm-hmm.
What's his name? Who's the police commissioner now?
His name escapes me.
Father, his older brother, went to Ireland and was in charge of
Mm-hmm.
It's after smoke, they could sue you. It was terrible.
People have threatened me for making a resource, a media literacy resource, so,
But
you know.
that's why it's good because it's little things, but have them.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Oh, well, I want to thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for having me.
So,
I like how ending on jail and suing and like, yep, we are in dark times. Cool. Thank you everyone for coming.